In this movie, I'll introduce you to the lighting effects filter, and along the way, we'll transform this somewhat flat portrait shot from the Fotolia image library into this more dynamically lit scene here, which also offers some higher contrast. And the great thing about lighting effects is if you get it right, you can make the scene appear as if it was really lit that way when it was captured. I'll go ahead and switch back to my starter image here. Now you can apply lighting effects as an editable smart filter, but before you do, you need to convert your image into a smart object. So I'll double click on the background here inside the layers panel in order to convert it to a new layer, call it woman, and click OK. Then, using the rectangular marquee tool, I'll right click inside the image window and choose convert to smart object. The next step is to go up to the filter menu, choose render, and choose lighting effects. And lighting effects, just like the blur gallery, is one of these filters that takes over your entire screen. Now, by default, you just have one spotlight, and I'll explain what's going on with the lights in just a moment. But I typically like to start with one of the presets. And just so you know what kind of lights are available to you, I'll start with Blue Omni here. And what we end up with is a single point light. And notice that it's called point at the top of the properties panel. You also have two others that you can work with, and you can switch between them as well. I'm going to stick with point, however, so I can demonstrate how it works. Notice that you can drag inside of the light to move it to a different location. And you can also drag on this ring. You need to make sure that it turns yellow so that you can scale the light source so that it covers a smaller area or a larger area. But you cannot change its direction. And that's because a point light is like a bare light bulb. It's going in all directions away from the light. Another option, I'll go ahead and switch here to parallel directional. You'll see these two little lights right here. And if you hover over them, you'll see one's Infinite Light 1 and the other is Infinite Light 2. You can click on these guys to switch between them, or you can see your lights over here in the lights panel. And you can click here to switch between the lights as well. Now notice if I drag anywhere inside the preview, whether I drag on that little ball there, or whether I drag in the center of this thing or anywhere else, I'm changing the direction of the light, but I am not changing its position. So in many ways, an infinite light is the opposite of a point light. Think of sunlight. Basically, the sun is, for all intents and purposes, infinitely far away. You can't alter its position. You can just alter its direction with respect to the Earth, for example. And then finally, I'll go ahead and switch my preset this time to crossing. Here we have spotlights, and I'll go ahead and zoom a little farther out so that we can see them in action here. When you drag outside of a spotlight, like so, you can rotate it, and you can also change its position by dragging somewhere inside the light. It's like a real spotlight. You can point it at something, and you can move it to a different location. Now, this handle is pretty much the light source. At least you can think of it that way. If you're going to drag it to a new location, you want to make sure that you see the words scale with, even though it seems to me we're really scaling the length of the footprint here. But in any case, you want to make sure you see that, because if I drag just a little off like so and it says move like it does now, then I'll move the light source to a different location. So you've got to be careful. I'll make sure I can see scale width, and then I'll drag this guy down. And the opposite handle is going to move as well. And then notice these side handles, which I think should be called scale width, but they're called scale length. You can go ahead and drag them to different locations to open up that light source like so. You also have control over the intensity of the light. And one way to change the intensity is to drag inside this little ring right here. And it'll actually say intensity when you can modify the value. And then you can just go ahead and drag inside this ring. And I'm looking for a specific value of 25, actually. And that intensity value will also show up here inside the properties panel. Notice that you have control over the color of the light, but I'm going to leave mine white. And then finally, you have this hotspot option. The hotspot is this ring right here. Problem is that the option doesn't really work in this particular version of CS6. I have a version of CS6 that was updated with the Creative Cloud, and that broke hotspot. So you can see I can reduce the value, and I can see the ring change, but when I release, I don't get any different result. I get the same result I had before, which is how it was set up by default, just so that hopefully you and I can get similar results. Next, we have these values down here. And by the way, you can give yourself a little more room in the Properties panel by dragging this horizontal line between the two panels down. And all of these options, exposure through ambience, they affect the actual object that you're lighting. So they're material settings. So if you increase the exposure value, you're actually adding light to the object itself. You can also reduce the value if you want to take some of that light away. I'm going to go ahead and leave that option set to 0. What's important to note is this colorize option has nothing to do with exposure. It has everything to do with ambience down here. Now you also have a gloss setting, and notice as soon as I change that setting, even just a little bit, I get an entirely different result, again, inside this version of the software. But the idea is you can either have a very glossy scene, or you can drag this all the way down to -100 to have a matte scene. And I'm going to leave it set to -100, in fact. Metallic, you can think of as being shiny metal when it's set to 100, or a more plastic effect when you have it set to -100. I'm going to leave that guy set to +100, however. And then we come to ambience. First, you want to set the color of the ambience, because notice that it's cranked up to 100 right now. But if I make a change to the ambience value, nothing happens on screen. And that's because the color of the ambient light for this particular preset is black. So I'm going to go ahead and crank this guy back up to 100%. And then I'll click on that color swatch. Now, if you subscribe to the Creative Cloud, you're going to see this 32-bit color picker. If you don't, then you'll just see the standard color picker. I'm going to stick to modifying these HSB values down here just so that you and I can once again get the same results regardless of which upgrade to the software you may be using. I'm going to change the hue value to 210 degrees, raise the saturation value to 100%, and take the brightness value up to 100% as well. And you can see that ends up infusing the scene with that blue color. Now I'll click OK. Now the great thing about ambience is you can either crank it up like so in order to infuse the scene with that blue, or you can take it to a negative value, as we see here, in order to infuse the scene with a complementary color. In our case, this orange hue. Anyway, I'm going to take it to -10, so we have a little bit of warmth associated with the scene. Now, all of these values, exposure through ambience, as I say, they affect the material of the image. And as a result, if you change any of these values for one of your light sources, then you'll change them for both. That's not true for either intensity or hotspot or the color of the light. Now I'm going to switch back to Spotlight 1 here, and I'm going to go ahead and drag it around as well. Move it ever so slightly over to the left here, and then I want to grab Scale With, make sure you see those words, so you can drag it down to about there, if you will. Also go ahead and drag this Scale Length value out to about here so that we have a pretty open light source like this. And I'm also going to change this intensity setting for this light source. I'm going to take it up to 40. Now notice I'm taking care that I don't make the scene too hot. I don't want to have any blown highlights. You never do when you're lighting a scene. And you don't have a histogram inside this window, so you just have to keep an eye on things. Notice that you can add a light by clicking on one of these icons. So I could add a new spotlight, or a new point light, or a new infinite light. And then finally, I'm not going to click on this, but you can reset the current light to its appearance, either the one associated with the preset in my case, or its appearance when you first visited the dialog box in case you come back to your settings. Now I'm going to go ahead and click OK in order to apply that light. And notice that I'm zoomed out from my image, and that's because I was zoomed out inside the lighting effects window as well. So I'll just go ahead and press Control-0 or Command-0 on a Mac in order to zoom in a bit. And then I'm going to change my blending settings by double-clicking on the little slider icon to the right of the words Lighting Effects. And I'll change the mode from normal to overlay, like so. And then I'll take the opacity value down to 66% in order to create this version of the scene. Now I'll click OK. And that, friends, is at least one way to work with the lighting effects filter here inside Photoshop.